Our last piece today is with Doug Usher. We have been thinking a lot about kind of a baseline for where we are right now, on rural thoughts and rural perspectives. And of course, the age old method of doing that is we do a lot of social listening, but we also do a lot of polling. And so Doug Usher has been with us for a long time. He and I have done a lot of dog and pony shows together talking about the importance of rural. I think it's also important to know where we are right now in terms of rural attitudes. So Doug, take it away, and then maybe you have time for a few questions at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. And the last time I presented, was the final presenter on a conference, was at the Carpenters International meeting in Myrtle Beach, and I was standing between them and golf. So I wasn't particularly well received. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Senator Heitkamp will be here afterwards, that we'll get through this. Could you put up the presentation? Who's ever doing the technical support? Thank you. So we have been doing survey work for one country. Some we've released publicly. Some has helped present some internal strategy for the project and for folks who are affiliated with it. And so we've just conducted our most recent one, which we finished literally at the beginning of this week. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So it was a survey of 1,000 people in rural zip codes, rural areas in the country. We actually did a national sample this time, just to see if there was a difference if we look at the entire country versus just some targeted areas. And to be honest, we saw very similar results to things we've seen in the past, but obviously with a twist now that we have a new Democratic president, compared to where we were the last couple of times we've been in the field. With that all said, I think we're singing some of the same tune we've been singing for a little while, which is that we see a challenging mood for Democrats among rural voters. And it's not to say, if you look at the actual votes from last time, and I know the Senator Heitkamp has presented to at least some of you on this, all the data point to ending the slide among rural voters, and now the job is to bring them back to where they were not, 4 cycles ago, but just a couple cycles ago. But right now we've got a distance to cover. So let's go to the next slide, please. What's really interesting, we did our first survey with one country about 2 years ago, and then among rural voters, then in targeted states, the most important issue was immigration and border security. And alas, 2 years later, immigration and border security is still the most important issue. We asked voters to look at all of these issues and choose their first and second most important issue. So again, immigration is clearly on people's minds, and it hasn't really receded. I'm sure if we had done polling consistently, it might have gone up and down. But even in this time of COVID-19, it is number one. Now with that said, addressing COVID-19 is number two, the second most important issue. And federal spending and jobs and economic growth, and then healthcare. So if you look at those are really the top issues. What's interesting is national security was a little bit lower. Consumer costs and inflation, I'll get to that in just a minute, because it's actually, I think, it's a little bit of an illusion what we see here, because it is very important. But climate change, again, clearly important for those in rural areas, but in terms of what they expect the federal government to address, it does fall a little bit lower. Some of the other things, including crime, racial equality, childcare, they all tested below 10%. Not to say they're not important, but just not the top priorities for voters in rural areas. Let's go to the next slide, please. We looked at issues in a slightly different way, just gave a bunch of statements to see whether they agreed or disagreed with the statements. Okay, and of all the statements, and they varied from things about policy to things about their personal life, etc. We're showing the top ones here. The very top agreement came with the cost of things I need every day, like food, clothes, and gasoline, is going up fast. Okay, we hear this in focus groups. It's just so omnipresent in people's lives, not just in their daily spending, but of course in what they're hearing on the news as well. The second statement of highest agreement, and I think this is where, we'll talk a little bit about reconnecting with rural voters, the expectation that trade schools and a skilled labor force can provide the foundation of a successful career to support a family. What I think is really important about this, isn't so much whether it is in fact the case, because obviously it's becoming more and more challenging to do that. But with that said, it is the case that it is a foundational part of rural voter belief. And we can't ignore that even as we're talking about the importance of college education, paying for college education and helping people get college degrees. But the idea that there is also another route to success. With that said, distrust about politicians is very, very high. Concern about disinformation from the media. Now, let's be clear. This tested, high among Republicans and Democrats. So it's not, when we say disinformation, it depends on who you are talking to. And then next is family farms are disappearing faster than ever before. Again, these aren't, you can't just take these statements and say, okay, let's act on them, but you can put them with the issue priorities and start to get a bit of a flavor for how they're approaching decisions around politics. Let's take the next slide, please. Now, I guess we could call this somewhat good news, is that on the one hand, by a 23-point margin, they believe that the Democratic Party does not consider the rural voters' way of life when they make decisions. Now, that said, they don't feel that great among how Republicans address them either. Okay, so sure, there's definitely a sliver of good news here, which is to say, they are throwing all politicians out and with the same, they're painting them all with the same brush. With that said, it's a pretty significant gap for Democrats at 23 points, a half that gap at 12 points with Republicans. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, here's where the problem comes, where we look, we look at that last slide, talk about Republicans. But with that said, we tested a lot of politicians here from across the spectrum. If you take a look from Nancy Pelosi, Joe Manchin among Democrats, Charles Schumer, et cetera, Mitch McConnell, as well as Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the only person we tested, and I would go so far as to say you'd have to test a really long list to find anybody else who has a net favorable personal rating among rural voters. And just note just how much stronger. You got 42% saying they have a very favorable opinion of Donald Trump and 13% of a somewhat favorable. With that said, you have 33% very unfavorable, but that's equal to Mitch McConnell, who only has a 31% favorability rating, and is well below Pelosi and President Biden. But I want you to just recognize that one of the issues we have is that you have the Republican Party, which they don't trust fully, obviously feel a little bit better about than they feel about the Democrats. But then you've got Donald Trump as this separate North Star that they care and certainly have a positive feeling about, much more positive than anyone else we tested, and probably anyone else in the political landscape. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, one thing that was really interesting, which we found, is that despite all of this distrust, discontent, certainly concern about immigration, et cetera, and inflation, they actually have a pretty positive view of their current financial situation, whether that is residual to COVID benefits, whether it is just some general contentment based on economic rebound, et cetera. We have 62% saying that it's neither excellent, their current financial situation is excellent or good. And looking to the next year, you've got a plurality saying they're confident and optimistic about their financial situation in the next year. Again, such an incredible distance from our traditional way we think about politics, which is things are going great, the leadership is Democratic. This is actually what, if you were to start with this, if I were to start the presentation with this, you wouldn't imagine that you would see what happened in terms of the rest of the survey. Let's go to the next slide, please. One of the problems right now for Biden, it's not a big surprise, as we're seeing this in national polling, but we have a pretty significant drop off for Biden. Trump remains pretty much as strong. Let's go to the next slide, please. So on the left side, you have what the rural vote was in 2020 from the exit polls right now. And we also found, we screened in people, and that's what we had was the self-report among the voters we had was of the people that were in our survey. They voted 54% for Trump, 42% for Joe Biden, 2% someone else, 2% can't remember. That's about the same divide as what we saw in exit polls. Right now, we see a pretty substantial drop-off for Biden, basically a 10-point drop-off. And we do also see a drop-off for Trump. That's probably because we had a someone else category. We want to be sure to give that as an option. And frankly, that could be part of the drop-off for Biden. But the reality is for Biden to win a re-election, we need to be at the level we were at last time. Some of you have sat through, as Senator Heitkamp mentioned, the dog and pony shows we did with actual data going into 2020, showing that if we had dropped off, if we continued the drop off from Clinton's performance in 2016 to 2020, we probably would have won the popular vote by 1 or 2 points, but would have been, decimated the Electoral College. Obviously, Biden won the popular vote by 4 points, but and did better in the Electoral College. But as you can imagine, a drop off of 10 points in rural voters, or even frankly 5 or 6 points among rural voters, would be more than enough to move some states back into the red column. Let's go to the next slide, please. We asked them whether he has exceeded, met, or fallen short of your expectations. That is Joe Biden. And as you can see from the pie chart on the right, a majority say he's fallen short of their expectations. That is problematic across the world of rural voters. It's not the end of the world by any stretch, because if you had a group that voted 52% for Donald Trump, it's pretty, or 54% for Donald Trump, it's pretty hard to move off of that. I will note that we have 21% of Democrats who say that Biden has fallen short of their expectations, which is a considerable issue. And then finally, 24% of Biden voters say that they have that he's not met their expectations. And if you look at the Biden drop off, that is people that voted for Biden last time and aren't, you've got 55%, actually the same number as the overall sample, that say he has not met expectations. Let's go to the next slide. We looked at the approval numbers for Biden. 42% overall approval. Again, not that surprising, not far off. From a little bit lower than what we're seeing nationally. However, do note the COVID response, right, and his response to COVID. So, while we can get wrapped around, the axle talking about COVID restrictions, et cetera, in rural America, he gets the most credit for addressing the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, followed by improving the economy and creating jobs. I mean, he's only net negative by 3 points. So as we think through, moving forward, which we'll talk a little bit about shortly, we do see some, in a lot of ways, there is some validation for the strategy of COVID-19 first, dealing with the economy, and then if you just go down to rebuilding America's infrastructure, and then you tie in climate change, you get the places where he's actually doing a little bit better, and so building on that is the key to build up a little bit higher. Now, having said that, what are the bottom two? Supporting family farms and agriculture and protecting the rural way of life. So with all this said, there's just a sense that he's not speaking to them, even as they give approval for some of the things that he's doing. Let's go to the next slide, please. With that said, just to go into some details, 42% total approved, 55% disapproved, 44% disapproved strongly. Not a big surprise. Those are primarily Republicans there. Very high approval ratings with Black rural voters, pretty strong among Hispanics as well. Democrats, of course, in good shape too. Now, with that, the other thing to add to that is, you've got 54% approval among those who've dropped off of Biden. So there is, getting those people back is not quite as hard as it might seem. But it is notable that he's actually performing okay among those voters. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, with all that, we've got 57% who, looking backwards, approved of Donald Trump's job as president. 40% disapprove. You've got 86% approval among Republicans. You've got 23% approval among Democrats. That is, given the highly partisan nature of what's going on in our country, that is a shockingly high retroactive approval for Trump. And you look across ages, again, this is across the entire world category. So obviously young Democrats would not, would be disapproving of Trump, but you've got under 30 giving Trump nearly 60% job approval. So there's a lot there for him to build on, needless to say. And, we shouldn't have any illusion that even after losing the election, even doing things that we consider abhorrent, he still has an extremely strong standing in rural areas. Let's go to the next slide. And if I were to summarize what, steps forward, first and foremost is results. Let's go to the next slide, please. We asked them, okay, what would you like to see Biden prioritize? And this, as you can imagine, landed exactly where some of the federal priorities were. Just in this open-ended, they also said stepping down. Obviously, not something he's going to prioritize, but it was interesting that that's what they said when asked. But again, immigration is just, it continues to be something where they want to see action. COVID, we do see things like the deficit and spending pop up. And let's go to the next slide, because I think we get a little bit more information here. We talked, of course, about Build Back Better. We just asked straight out about Build Back Better. Of course, we attached it to President Biden, who has, as you know, mixed approval based on this and favorability. With all that said, you still have plurality approval, 47% in favor of his plan for infrastructure and social programs, right? So we didn't sugarcoat it and leave out social programs or focus on, give any more detail. Just based on that description, it's got plurality support. You've got, as you can imagine, 32% strong opposition, but that's significantly less than, the percentage of folks who have a strong, unfavorable feeling towards him. So if you will, there's actually, potentially 10 to 12 points, 12% of rural voters who say they hate Joe Biden, yet support his rural voter, his Build Back Better plan. But the other thing they're hearing about it, of course, is that they think the spending is too high. They're hearing about the spending. So you have a plurality saying that, that spending is too high. And we didn't do an open end on it, but I could imagine that if we asked, what's the one thing you know about Build Back Better, you'd have a lot of rural voters saying it's a lot of money. Again, not suggesting that this is the roadmap. And by, I don't want to get too prescriptive with polling data, because I think that's where pollsters can and should get into trouble. And if they cut back the price of Build Back Better, the cost of it, there's not a guarantee that people are going to then turn around and say, well, this is the right price. But the discussion around it that is resonating in rural areas is that it is too expensive. Let's go to the next slide, please. And just as I noted before, it outpaces his job approval, right? So you've got 47% supporting Build Back Better, 42% giving him a positive approval rating. So, everything about, this feels like it's a political plus for him, especially if upon passage, people start to feel the benefits relatively quickly. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another opportunity is healthcare. We noted earlier that while not the top priority, we talked about immigration and COVID, but healthcare remains a concern. And what's interesting is we tested a few different parts of healthcare to see what is most important to them. And first and foremost was addressing the rising cost of insurance premiums. followed by making it easier to find and see a doctor when you need one. And I think that idea of cost and access is really something that is, that is winning or that is winnable. Especially again, when you tie that's something you can really tie to their day-to-day lives and the inflation that they're seeing, whether real or in some cases perceived, really ties to them. So again, action on healthcare is something that I think, based on this, that they would welcome. Let's go to the next slide. I think that's it. Thanks all. And of course, Senator Heitkamp, I'm happy to take questions. And I think we could see questions in the chat if people can put them up. But happy to answer any questions.
Before you go to the questions in the chat, Doug, I just want to call people's attention to page 5, which is, we always say, oh, Democrats don't understand rural voters. Well, rural voters don't think Republicans understand them by a majority either. And so I think that this goes to the challenge that we have. Yes, we're losing at a greater percentage, but so the Republicans shouldn't be proud of their rural attitudes about the Republican Party in rural America either. And so I think it goes back to making sure that rural voters know that Build Back Better is going to deliver, and not one Republican is going to vote for it. The other thing that I would say is that when you look at favorability numbers, and we can wring our hands about Biden's numbers, but let's compare Biden's numbers with Nancy Pelosi's or Chuck Schumer's or AOC's, and what you're going to see is Biden's numbers as a Democrat holds much. People view him more favorably than they do what I would say the more progressive wing of the party. And so I think there's some opportunity there. And the final thing that I would say as somebody who has made this a major political priority, and that is we don't need to win back rural America. We don't need to win rural America by 51 points. We just need to do better. And better than what we have. And we need to be able to have a base of support so we can continue to build. And so my question to you before we turn it over to folks in the chat is when you look at that base of support in this polling, and you think about kind of where we are right now, do you think that Biden has brought back, if you compared this to polling you've done in the past, you said we've stopped the slide, but we haven't improved our chances. Can you elaborate on that, I guess? Sure.
Well, first of all, I think that is a great point, and I tend to paint the dark side of the tapestry, as you probably know from my other presentations. But it is a great point to say that despite all of this, despite all of the constant incoming that President Biden is taking from Republicans, that he has maintained a level when his national numbers are coming down as well, so distant from the parts of the party that they hate, is in a lot of ways pretty good news. And he's maintained that reputation. The challenge, of course, will be to track this over time, to see if the success of Building Back Better, actually getting these things done, can translate into a Biden victory versus, as you mentioned, Republicans not voting for it and then, putting it towards all of their pet projects and taking credit. But definitely I think something you've talked about before, there's such sourness towards Democrats. The conversation just needs to at least begin to change towards some positive accomplishments without, being about Democrat or Republican, just things that are getting done.
Yeah. One of the questions in the chat, Doug, is on the immigration issue. The largest employer of undocumented workers is agriculture. So their neighbors are hiring. And that for a lot of people, certainly people in urban areas, is such a disconnect that there's these attitudes about immigration, but yet agriculture is heavily dependent on visas and on ag workers.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And I think it's something, what can you say to folks who live the fact that, you can almost map opinion towards immigration becoming more of a priority the further you are from an actual border. Right. And I think to your point, it is part of which we saw earlier, it's part of a broader perception of cultural assaults on way of life.
I think the other thing, Doug, that I would say here is that it fits within that kind of you don't understand our way of life. That is all euphemisms for culture, right? Right. What we used to say back in the early 2000s, gun gods and gays, and the Democratic Party's, kind of that those aren't our values, but yet we haven't done a good enough job reflecting that these are human values that we are in fact standing for, and that these are important values that I'm sure they share. It's just the world is changing, and in some ways changing in directions that they don't like.
Exactly. And so, you can't force feed people something they don't want or they don't like, or you can't, at least, to the extent we can hope how people are thinking or would think is different from how they actually are thinking and are feeling. And I think this poll, reflects some of what you're talking about.
Well, I think we're going to release these results later. You've gotten a little hint here of the work that one country is doing to try and raise awareness. The other thing I would say about immigration, Doug, is that people are always kind of shaking their head like, why would you care? I think in this context we have to think about competency, and a lot of what they saw, whether it was the saw on television. I'm not saying that those are the correct images, but the images that they're seeing at the border and the images that they're seeing in Afghanistan argue, well, you don't know what you're doing. You're not competent to run the country. And so I think we've got to understand some of these aren't necessarily about whether they want immigration reform. Both John Hoeven and I voted for immigration reform when we were in the Senate, and the Senate voted overwhelmingly. It's that this doesn't look like we know what we're doing, that we're competent. And I think that's one of those issues that need to be addressed by the administration.
No question. And certainly the perception that nothing's happening that's good,
Yeah,
I think is clearly carrying through to these voters.
Although the kind of flip side of that is I'm doing pretty well, though. I'm doing pretty well, and when we obviously have access to the crosstabs, but you will see kind of the demographics, the financial demographics of the people who were surveyed, and it tells you that they aren't doing as well in terms of total dollars, but yet their well-being is better because maybe they're getting a little help with COVID money, and maybe they've gotten a little help on healthcare if they live in a state that is in fact expanded Medicaid. Maybe they're a healthcare worker that's been able to keep their job because the hospital stayed open. And so and certainly farmers have been a focus for both parties. And so,
right. And maybe it's in contrast to the depths of COVID as well.
Yeah,
right. The idea
right.
That we're not.
Right. That we're more optimistic than we were 10 months ago, or, 2 years ago. So another question in the chat said, do you think that if the messaging were clear, that big Build Back Better, that it's also an investment in rural America, the feeling that the price is too high would change?
I think that you don't want to be arguing about the price right now. I hate to sound like a salesperson, but you really need to talk about the features. It's the last discussion, right? Is this the price? But seriously, we should just be talking about the benefits to rural America, because whether it's 3.5 or 7 or 1, it's going to be attacked as being too much money. So at the very least, we want to be sure that the benefits come clear. If they happen to think that then it's the right price, great, but we've got to get the benefits through.
Well, and I also think the important part of this is that albeit slight, but the slide for Biden among Democrats is frustration that, and we hear it, that we didn't get the $15 an hour minimum wage. We haven't gotten voter reform. We haven't gotten, criminal justice reform. Certainly important for our African American communities and Native American communities well overrepresented in the criminal justice system in North Dakota, and certainly the federal criminal justice system. And so, these are the sooner we can get this package done, the more we can turn to those things and try and bring along a few good Republicans who can be helpful in responding to the challenges that so many people have in this country. So, anyway, Doug, I think we're out of time, and I think we put you at the end of the program because we thought you would hold everybody here, and I think you probably have. I look forward to talking to you and maybe doing more and more of these kinds of presentations as the word gets out that we've done this polling. I think you've done a great job, and you have a great history and background in understanding kind of what these trends are. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator.
You bet. We're going to close out now. First, I want to thank everyone for, number one, attending, but I mainly want to thank our amazing presenters. We've had 3 days of amazing panels, 3 days of optimism, pessimism, but commitment. I think commitment to raising the voices of rural voices, the rural issues, understanding what can be done, where we can do it, working together, whether it is in Washington, D.C., or whether it is on our state kind of electoral systems. I think the country needs to, I think if we're looking at the administration, we need to say we need a smart, practical, and fair approach to immigration. I think that's a fair thing to say. This isn't news to me. We see this over and over again. We see it in social listening that we do when we look at what are people talking about on Facebook, what are people talking about Instagram. This poll just bears out exactly what we've been talking about. And I would just remind everybody that what Doug said is that this is not, you might think that rural California would have a different perspective than rural North Dakota, and what he's telling you, they didn't see a lot of deviation across the rural demographics. I think we should tout the success of getting COVID under control. I think we're seeing more and more of our folks being vaccinated. We still have challenges here in places like North Dakota. You look at the South, less challenges there. It is really a credit, I think, to the administration for the work that they've done on COVID, and we shouldn't be backing up one bit. We've now crossed the line between government getting involved and personal responsibility for your own health care. And so jobs and opportunity continue to be a lifeline through rural communities. But I would add to that, it's not just jobs and opportunity, it's hope. It's hope that your kids could live in places that people have kind of forgotten about, that we can stop the hemorrhage and in some ways the brain drain from rural America and create the opportunities, but also create the lifestyle. I think we always say, you build a job, they'll come. And I think yesterday I said, I met with a business that had 80 primary sector jobs, good paying jobs in manufacturing in rural America, and they couldn't fill them because people didn't want to live in rural America. And so we've got to change that attitude, and we change it by, I think, becoming more welcoming in rural America. Access to affordable health care, again, huge issue. And I would say, add to that, based on my experience, not just healthcare, but mental and behavioral healthcare. We know that deaths of despair, suicides, overdoses, we have seen epidemics in parts of rural America, but no assistance, and children who are living in homes where people are struggling, not being able to get the assistance that they need because there's not a workforce. There is a path forward. We just need to let people know where we stand. And we need to certainly, those of us who are Democrats need to find that common ground, because I think that 90% of what we believe is commonly shared. And when we let the narrative be about the conflict between progressives and maybe more conservative Democrats, we really do a disservice to, I think, the great work that the administration is doing and the great work that we can do working together. So over the past 3 days, I tell you, I've been energized. I've been calibrated in terms of my belief system, but mainly I've been reaffirmed in terms of the work we're doing and the importance of the work we're doing, not just politically, but the work that we're doing to save places or to assist places that I grew up in that I love, that have raised so many great Americans who have served in the military, who have served in Congress, who have advanced ideas and built opportunities. We just cannot leave any part of our country behind. As one panelist said, we are on the cusp of a rural renaissance, and by putting ideas in action, we can make them reality. And I truly believe that, but we will only do it if we continue to raise our voices. So I want to thank Tom Bryant and his team for the great work that they did at One Country. I want to thank Tessa, whose brainchild this was, an idea this was. I want to thank all of our wonderful sponsors who made this possible. We had hoped to do this in person in Milwaukee. That just wasn't possible. I want to brag on our great board of directors who you've met through this process, whether it's JD and Ashton, Secretary Espy, Joe Donnelly. We have a great group of people and rising stars like Anthony Daniels there in Alabama. We're so proud of that we've brought some of these, especially local folks, into the mainstream of national politics because their voices are so important and they're going to carry the banner into the future. So I want to encourage you all to stay engaged. We'll have tons of this data. You might say, oh, I remember what she said. You'll be able to find a lot of information on our One Country website. I want to encourage you to sign up for our email list. I want you to see the latest at onecountryproject.com. Follow us on Twitter. We remain dedicated to raising the money, to keep the investment going, to raise rural voices within the Democratic Party, but also rural policies to the Democratic Party that will make a difference. And, I got a little bit of a criticism when I said we don't expect to win. We won't get back where we need to be in one cycle or even two cycles. But if we don't begin those steps back up, we will have difficulty maintaining a majority. But more importantly, we can never be a 51% rural party if we don't start now. And so please, just excellent, excellent work. Thank you again for everything that you've done. I look forward to the feedback, things that maybe we missed that you thought we should put out there. But thank you and have a great, great weekend and continue to believe that the rural renaissance will lead to a reality, and that reality will make us truly one country again. Thank you so much.